Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Whitaker, the editor of Kane's Beverage News Daily and host of the Beverage Barons podcast series. And we are very happy to have with us today, all the way from England, no less, Amanda Barnes, who is an award winning British journalist and editor, and she specializes in wine and travel writing. So she spends a fair amount of her time in South America in the wine regions and is a regular correspondent for publications like Decanter and Four Doors, which is a travel publication, 750, The Guardian, and The Telegraph. And she is currently in the second year of her studies to become a Master of Wine and is also the author of the South America Wine Guide. And if I don't know authors, I would bet that we're going to hear more about the South America Wine Guide here in just a minute. But she is actually here for the purpose of talk about wines of Uruguay because she's going to be in New York City in about 4 days. So it would be on Tuesday. And so she's going to give us a preview of that. Actually, maybe I should say a sip, but not a gulp. So if you want to hear her whole Uruguay presentation, you'll have to travel to New York, and I'll make available to you a link from Kate that if she can get you in, she will. So, and hopefully somebody will accept that offer. But, it is pretty short notice if you have to fly in. So no guarantees, Kate. Kate is, by the way, Kate Corcoran, who is a PR person working with Wines of Uruguay. So good afternoon, Amanda. How are you in Europe and Canada? So tell us about the weather there to start off with. You look awfully happy, but you also look like you have wet hair. So I hope you don't go out in the next 10 minutes.
Well, I'm in Toronto at the moment, waiting for the US borders to open and to make my way first to Washington, DC, where we have our first events, and then New York, and then finally in Dallas, where we're going to also be at Texom presenting some of the wines of Uruguay. So I am actually very happy to be here, and the weather's quite nice up here, cold but sunny in Toronto, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the weather is like in different parts of the US next week.
Well, that should be very interesting. So tell us a little bit about Wines of Uruguay. Why do we care about Uruguay? And I mean, quite frankly, it's a region that I hadn't even thought of as a wine region because, Chile's got the propaganda machine out there running 24/8 and 369. So, so tell us about Uruguay.
Well, I always like to actually sometimes start by talking about Chile and Argentina in order to understand the difference that is Uruguay. Because when we think of Chile and Argentina, which are the two biggest producing countries in South America, we think of warm climates, we think of sunny climates, and we think of very dry, arid climates. So you typically get, that really kind of full-bodied Malbec and fruity, plummy Carmenere. But when we think of Uruguay, we really need to change the chip because even though it is right next to Buenos Aires, we have a completely different climate to the wine regions of Chile and Argentina. So Uruguay has this Atlantic climate, and it's quite a humid but mild climate, much more similar to Galicia in Spain or even Bordeaux in France, depending on the vintage. So the wine styles of Uruguay are very unique in South America and very unique in the New World. And that's what I think really sings. And that's why I hope that everyone's going to be excited to taste these wines and really notice the difference next week. I really do think they stand out for that very different climate. But there's other things about Uruguay that are really quite unique too. And for me, one of the most interesting aspects of Uruguayan wine are the families behind the wine. And we're looking at quite a small country, a population of 3 million and 12 million cows. So that gives you an idea. There are many more cows than people, but it's quite a small nation, but the wine industry is very diverse. So within it, we've got hundreds of different families, about 600 family producers that all focus on different grapes, that all have their own style, they have their own heritage and their own, very distinctive kind of wines to taste. And so even though Tannat is the champion grape of Uruguay, no Uruguayan Tannat tastes the same because each family has a very different way of approaching it in the vineyard, making it in the winery. And I think that kind of idiosyncratic nature of Uruguay is what makes it so fascinating to discover.
And there's something else about Uruguay that's really, to me, as a business reporter for decades, really fascinating, which is that it apparently is the most aggressively pro-capitalist country in South America. It's got a fabulous economic story that nobody has told either. So I don't know if you feel confident to talk about the economics of Uruguay, but when I looked that up, I said, wow, this is a country that really deserves the support of the United States and of U.S. buyers.
100%. Uruguay is, I would never describe it as aggressive because Uruguayans are so kind and humble, and even their politics, they're very open. So they're very open to, you know, capitalism, they're open to opportunity, and they're open to exchange. And so it is the most stable politically and economically in South America, and also, you know, one of the most educated societies in the New World, really. I mean, the education levels in Uruguay are incredibly high, even compared to some of the, you know, European countries or North American countries. Uruguay, one thing that I love, they were the first country in the world to ever give every single child a laptop. I think it was in 2009, so that every child had a laptop in order to be able to learn. So it's little policies like that that really show you the character of Uruguayans and their real, you know, commitment to progression and to equality and to, you know, education and communication. They are, you know, very intellectual people. Typically, you sit down around an asado and a barbecue, and you always end up talking about politics and history and culture, and it's never a fight. It's never aggressive. Unlike some of the other neighbors, it's a polite, kind of animated and educated conversation. So definitely, if you are interested in economics and politics, it's fascinating for that reason.
So, Kate, I have to say, Amanda, I have to say, I'm accepting your edit of my comment. It's not aggressively capitalist; it's just softly pro-capitalist.
Open.
Okay, but I do like that. I do like that laptop for every kid idea. I think that's fabulous because, you know, that helps to really level the playing field.
It really does. And I think, you know, when that's another thing that when you're in Uruguay and spending time with people there, children are part of everyday society. So they are part of the dinner conversation, you know, they don't go to bed until late, but they're very much part of that, you know, community, and the adults spend lots of time with children talking to them like adults. And I think in the wine industry, we also see that the younger generations start really early working in their family wineries, and so they're never really kind of divorced from the subject. It's not something that they come into later in life. They do it, you know, they work with their family when they're younger as well as college and university, but that kind of feeds through to the wine industry as well. And I think this new generation actually of winemakers that we're seeing are incredibly promising and exciting in terms of some of the, you know, great ways that they're using their family heritage, but they're also bringing in new things that they've learned in their own studies and education abroad as well.
So you want to talk about that a little bit more, or you want to start focusing on specific wineries or specific styles?
Well, we can, I mean, I'd love to continue talking about the kind of the families and the different generations. I mean, that really kind of, in every wine region, you have a similar story in that the wine industries normally kind of started. It's difficult with Uruguay because it was only independent in the 1800s. So we discussed their beginning of viticulture in the 1800s, but actually vines were grown there earlier, and they just weren't quite as documented or as productive because it was very much being battled between Brazil and Argentina. Everyone wanted a piece of Uruguay. And so it wasn't until the 1800s that they declared their independence that we look at the beginning of their viticulture. But from there, you know, we've really seen wine regions spawn all over the country and in different regions. But the main area is along the coast. And along the coast or the river, we get a lot of different generations of families that have been working there, you know, for a long time. The real heartland of Uruguay, which we're definitely going to be tasting next week, is Canelones, which is the region just outside of the capital, Montevideo. And that's obviously naturally because it was the biggest port, and it was where most people live. 2 and 3 Uruguayans live in Montevideo. And so that's where the market was. But it's also a really interesting patchwork of vineyards, with different slopes, different soils, and again, those very different varieties ranging from Zinfandel to Nebbiolo. You know, it really depends on the heritage of each family, whether they were Croatian, American, Italian, Spanish, and whichever part they come from. And there we're also getting some innovation with the new generations as well. We've got some kind of nice orange wines happening. We've got some very interesting kind of carbonic maceration with Tanat, one of which we will be pouring next week. And then further to the west, we have the river regions, which are next to the Rio de la Plata, which is the big river that separates Uruguay and Argentina. And that river spills out to the sea. So it's actually the biggest river mouth, I believe, the widest or one of in the world. And so it looks like a sea, but it is actually a river. And so you get a slightly kind of milder climate than you get a bit further along the coast. But you also get really interesting wines from there, lots of different generations of families, and again with their own styles and varieties. We've also seen a hub of investment happening there because it's right across the border from Argentina, and a lot of Argentinians love going to Uruguay because of that stability and because of that kind of oasis of calm that it is compared to Buenos Aires, for example. And so we've got lots of interesting developments happening, especially in Colonia, which is a very popular weekend getaway and absolutely gorgeous. If you ever go, Joel, you should go there because you've got cobblestone streets and just beautiful restaurants and bars and a lot of kind of great cultural spaces as well. And then the other kind of key region to identify in Uruguay is along the east coast, which is Maldonado. And that was historically planted, but actually it kind of fell to the wayside because it's considered poor farming land, which, as any wine writer knows, that translates into great wine land. That Uruguay is a nation of farmers as well. And so it just wasn't planted much. But in recent years, that has absolutely boomed. And now that is the third largest region and close to second in Uruguay. And there we have incredible granite soils and really kind of vivacious and energetic wines. And for me, one of the stars that's emerging there is Albarino, which kind of taps into what I was saying earlier about Uruguay having this quite Galician climate. And then there's lots of other regions to discover kind of inland and on the edges with Brazil, but I would save that for when people come to the tasting next week in DC or New York. That's your sip.
Very good. So, yeah, I can appreciate the desire of people from Argentina to slip over to Uruguay now and then, just based upon the chaos that country goes through. It seems like every 10 years or so, like probably every 20. But
every 10, and yeah, definitely every 10. But you know, I mean, my first visit to Uruguay was after living in Buenos Aires for 3 months in 2009, and when I arrived to Uruguay, I was like, oh, breathe again. Because Buenos Aires is amazing, but it is chaotic, but it's passionate and fun, and it's a beautiful place to visit. But Montevideo is a capital like no other. It is so quiet, so calm. You know, you can walk around and you know, you've got bits of the city to yourself, and it's just so peaceful and relaxing to visit. And much of Uruguay is like that. But also really, you know, interesting. And once you kind of start to meet people, you kind of get taken behind closed doors and really kind of get to see the really beautiful spirit that Uruguayans have.
so do you have any particular wines that you really prefer, or do you feel like with the trip you're on right now, you don't dare mention a particular brand name or family name?
No, I won't mention any particular wineries because I think that would be unfair because there's so many. The thing with Uruguay is you've got lots of small wineries that are really keen to get out there and ready to export. And so actually part of this mission for next week is to find some importers for these real gems that we've got. And then we've got some of the kind of larger wineries for Uruguay, which is still not that big. The larger wine for Uruguay, which do have a really nice import into the US that will also be present. But each of them have, you know, we have over a dozen. So we'd be going well over our allotted time if I mentioned them all. But they each have their own story, which is worth kind of discovering. And that's something that I've spent years kind of learning about and still love learning about those different stories. But I'll definitely mention some of my key varieties to look for. So Tanat is number one. It is the absolute kind of champion grape variety of Uruguay. And you might know the Tanats of Madaran, but the Tanats of Uruguay are really quite different. And we see different profiles of Tanat around the country as well. So Tanat is so named because it's one of the most tannic varieties. It's got 3 seeds instead of the normal one. or two in grapes. And so actually it can give you quite a powerful wine. But because Uruguay has been specializing in Tannat since the mid 1800s, they've really learned how to tame Tannat. And their nice humid climate actually is a real benefit for that. So you get Tannats, you do get Tannats that you can age wonderfully well, ones that you probably shouldn't open 10 years before the vintage. But then you also get some quite friendly, vibrant and fruit forward styles now, which you can certainly be drinking within a year or two of the vintage. That carbonic maceration style, which I mentioned earlier, you also get sparkling red Tannat, which is quite fun. And so Tannat in all its guises is worth looking for, and really getting to see how each family interprets it differently. And they'll often blend their Tannat too. So you get some nice kind of producers doing Tannat Viognier blends, which are quite interesting, or Tannat and Cabernet Franc, Tannat Marcellan. We're going to have all of these wines out next week. So a lot of Tannat to discover. And then other key varieties for me, as I mentioned earlier, the Albarino, particularly from the east. Albarino is just such an amazing, beautiful surprise from Uruguay. I think I've spoken to quite a few Spanish people about it, and given them Uruguayan Tannats, Albarinos to taste, and they're all a bit kind of shocked and humbled and worried because they're like, oh, okay, this is pretty good. This is definitely competing with our top Tannats of our top Albarinos, I should say, of Reis Baixas. So definitely look for the Albarino. And then there's lots of other interesting things. So Marcellan is really kind of growing and emerging in Uruguay. Cabernet Franc, I think we're seeing a really nice revival. But lots of weird and wonderful varieties too. So each family brings their own story. So, there's Pablo Falabrino, who has his Arnay, which comes from his Piedmont background. And there's the Artesana family from California that have their Zinfandel. There's lots of different beautiful stories with Tempranillo, with all kinds of diverse varieties. And so it's very hard to pigeonhole Uruguay.
Great. So tell us a little bit about yourself. And then I'm going to ask you to talk to us a little bit about the South America Wine Guide, which you must have spent years putting together. I cannot imagine how hard it is to put together a wine guide to an entire continent, for goodness sakes.
Yeah, well, I say it's the culmination of 10 years living there and then 2 years of writing and editing and designing. So I moved to South America in 2009. I am from the UK, as you might guess by my accent. And I really my wine life grew there, like experiencing, learning from the winemakers and the agronomists. And they all took me under their wing and really kind of taught me about their incredible wine culture, and also have given me the opportunity to see it change in the last decade. And we've seen enormous changes in South America in that time. And so I've been writing about the wines of South America for all that period for other magazines and books. And I thought, well, actually, I'd really like to write, an in-depth guide to the wines of the continent, and not only Argentina and Chile, which do get written about on a regular basis, but those lesser known countries like Uruguay, Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru. And so the guide is very much giving a lot of space and love and attention to each of these wine countries, and also all of the wine regions. So even in the kind of titan countries of Chile and Argentina, there are wine regions, plenty of, that people have never tasted or heard of before. And so the whole kind of ethos behind the guide is really to show the rich diversity that South America has, and why it is such a captivating wine continent, and has kept me enthralled for so long.
So how did you get into wine writing? I mean, what's your background? Obviously, as you say, you're from the UK, but tell us your story for a second.
Yeah, so I've always been a foodie. My parents have always loved to cook, and they've always, given us wine at the table while we were eating. And we've also traveled a lot as a family. So, my mum's actually from the US, my dad's English. And so we always, went back to the US to visit family, but we would also go to Europe a lot each summer. And they really kind of built into us the importance of learning about other cultures and communities, and trying different food. And so along with that came obviously wine. And so I started working as a journalist when I was 15. I started interning at newspapers and working on the weekends. And then I studied literature at university, comparative literature, and I really focused on a lot of magical realism. And that typically is obviously a Latin American genre. And so that's how I became enamored with South America from afar, was through the words of Borges and Garcia Marquez. And then in 2009, after working for newspapers for a couple of years, I really decided that I wanted to focus on food and travel writing. And I didn't think that you could write seriously about food without having a very good understanding of wine. And so I planned to go to South America, spend a year on a kind of sabbatical, if you like, and try and freelance and learn about wine in Argentina was the plan for 3 months. Then go focus on food in Peru for 3 months, and then focus on travel writing in Colombia for 3 months. And once I really started getting my teeth into wine, I realized that wine had everything that I loved: the travel, the gastronomy, but also culture, history, biology, geology. And it was just such a rich topic that I've never needed to kind of go beyond that. I still do some travel writing, as you mentioned. But wine for me, there's everything in that glass that you could ever kind of hope for. And so that's kind of what kept me there. And South America is such an amazing, beautiful continent to explore and discover. And, I've made so many great friends there that that's how I became kind of specializing in writing about the wines of South America.
Well, that's a terrific story in its own right. So you're going to be talking to a couple of wine tastings, one in Washington, D.C. I presume that's on Monday?
No, Tuesday. So Tuesday we've got DC. We've got in the morning one for the trade, and in the afternoon one for the evening one for consumers. The evening one is already sold out. So, but there are a couple tickets left for the trade. And then on Thursday, we're in New York. And again, we've got one in the morning for the trade and a few tickets left for the one in the consumer one in the evening. So jump in quick to get those tickets. And then we're at Texom the following week in Dallas.
Good. And you picked 3 nice markets to go into, I think. People don't understand. A lot of people don't understand. DC is actually a very rich market. I have a friend who came down here once, and he came back up to New Jersey when we lived there, and he said, there's more money than I've ever seen in my life. He was just speechless.
It's going to be my first time in DC, so I'm looking forward to exploring a bit. But the event sold out within, hours in DC. So there's clearly a thirst for interesting wines and discovering kind of new wine regions.
Yeah,
that's great. I'm really excited about that.
Great. So you'll have to send us a list of all the wines that you're going to be displaying, or that will be at the tasting, so we can put them up for people who live in Cleveland, Ohio, and can't get to either one of those locations easily.
Absolutely. I really encourage people to try and seek out the wines of Uruguay from home as well. And if they want to, there's my Uruguay ebook. If you only want to read about Uruguay, then you can use that as your guide to get through and discover the different varieties and regions. But definitely get on wine.com or whatever you use in order to find your Uruguayan wine, because it is a journey that no one ever regrets taking.
Great, Amanda. So tell us where, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
They'll find me on southamericawineguide.com, and they'll find me on my social media, South America Wine Guide. I think if you Google Amanda South America Wine, I think I'll probably come up.
Very good. Excellent. And where can they buy the South America Wine Guide?
So southamericawineguide.com/book. And then if you want the Kindle version, that's also on Amazon.
Okay, good. So Amanda Barnes, thank you so much for your time. I hope this has been productive for you. I hope you sell out those last few tickets that you have in the locations that you mentioned, New York, Washington, and Dallas. And we hope to talk to you again. A fabulous interview, I thought. So thank you so much.